How's it going, everybody? In this video, we're going to go ahead and set up MySQL community server on a Windows Server instance in the cloud. So as you can see here, we are in AWS. If you need to know how to set up an instance in AWS, check out my earlier videos on AWS Educate. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get this install started. So I'm going to go ahead and connect into my server. Of course, we've gone through this process. You got to use your decryption key that you have generated during the setup of your instance. Copy your password into RAM, and then download, which I already did, the remote desktop file. So once you click on that file, it should ask you to go ahead and connect to it. And you can right click and paste in that password you copied. It's going to go ahead and log you right into Windows Server after that. So what we're going to be doing here is installing MySQL. We're going to do it in a very special order, starting with MySQL Community Server. And to get to it, you have to do something kind of tricky. I mean, it's not too hard. It's just a little different from your typical Windows 10 install, because Microsoft's Windows Server operating systems are zero trust environments, which means that when you open up a browser, especially Internet Explorer, you're going to have to add an exception for every single website you go to. And you would be surprised at how many websites are tied to one single site, as you'll see here. I'm going to show you how to get around that to ease the process of downloading these tools you're going to need. But without further ado, let's continue. So go ahead and open up Internet Explorer. Once Internet Explorer opens up, you'll notice some recommendation settings you need to set. Just go ahead and ask me later on that. We're going to get Firefox. The first thing I'm going to do is try to get Firefox because it doesn't adhere to those internet security settings. And now, I know this is not a best practice on a Windows server unless you absolutely know what you're doing. So I'm going to go ahead and add these exceptions. And because we know what we're doing, we can go ahead and move forward this way. But just be careful about where you're going to go. Don't go in and don't use this to watch YouTube videos. Just use this to get the files you need. Ideally, we'd pull this off a share on the network, but since we're on the cloud in AWS, we're going to just pull it down from the website. So I'm going to get Firefox. Look how you got to add all these websites. Google Tag Manager, follow that to see what that's all about. You'll see Google's analytics engine. You'll see all types of different sites that are going to go ahead and track essentially your browsing to optimize the performance of Google's search engine. So I'm just going to keep adding. I'm going to download. Notice how I had to try downloading again. It didn't do it automatically because of the zero trust environment we're in. So go ahead and hit save. Run that. It's going to open the installer for Firefox and finish up that install process, which is going to go by pretty quick. So then we don't have to worry about continuing to add to our site or add to our browser's exception list. So give that some time to load. As soon as it's done loading, as you've seen before, when you install a browser, it's going to open up the Firefox browser. So we don't need Internet Explorer anymore. I'm just going to right click, close window. And then the first thing I'm going to get, and this is what I would recommend when you are installing MySQL, whether you're in Windows 10 or on a Windows Server OS, you're going to look up MySQL Community Server. The reason I'm going to get this software here and this installer is so that you can see that what it does for all of your dependencies and to retrieve all your dependencies. A dependency is essentially a program that MySQL relies on, right? Every application has dependencies, and typically the installer makes retrieving the dependencies easier. So first and foremost, I'm going to go ahead and grab this installer, save it, launch it. MSI is a Microsoft installer file, so it's for Microsoft, make sure you don't get the zip. Not for this particular install, because we're just doing the simple, straightforward install. Now, just like you're used to in installing any other program, it's going to pull up some automated options for you to get your database development environment set up. I would recommend you go ahead and do a full install. This is going to get everything you need. Notice how these are the requirements it's going to check for. So what we're going to do is we're going to execute that and allow this software to go out there to the different websites where these install files exist, pull them down, or in other words, download them and install them. So let's do that. So I'm going to hit execute. Notice how here it pulled up and it retrieved the Microsoft Visual C++ redistributable. So let's go ahead and install that. Let it run. Automation is a beautiful thing. Let it work. Try not to be too controlling of it. I'm going to install manually MySQL, because notice it got our Python connector, but we need to go ahead and get MySQL. I'm sorry, we need to get Visual Studio before we get MySQL, because this is a plugin for Visual Studio. So you're going to just open up another browser tab, do Visual Studio, go ahead and select the Downloads tab, get Community or link, get the Community Edition, free download. It's going to go ahead and start to download it. Let's give it some time. Save it. Here we go. We got the file, the installer file. Launch that. Continue. And it's going to grab all the dependencies for Visual Studio Code as well. Visual Studio is a great IDE to write code from within. I actually host my own personal blog site, which I would recommend anybody does. And I've got my Visual Studio Code tied to a GitHub repository. So I use Git to push any changes to my website. So I can just develop on my laptop, my website, push the changes, and then boom, the changes are on my site about 10 seconds later. So it's pretty convenient. I'm going to go ahead and get the Python development plugin here to install those packages, because we already know that one of the dependencies for MySQL had a Python connector as a requirement. Let's download it and make sure it gets that connector, because maybe it'll grab it with this package. So go ahead and install. This is a bit of a waiting process. You know, in IT, there's a saying that goes, hurry up and wait. And it really, you know, that's a saying in general, but I like to kind of format it for IT. And your workflow, much of the day, could involve installing or migrating or waiting on some process to finish. And in that time, you could be doing more things. So maybe you could start another process, or if you don't want to start another process, you could continue learning a skill that you've been wanting to learn. You could watch a quick video. You'd be surprised at how fast time will go. And if you're just waiting on something to load or to download or to install, it's not going to be harmful for you to just, you know, open up a browser and watch some educational videos on YouTube. Now, what I would say is a dangerous mindset to get into is, you know, a playful video game, you know, entertainment mindset. Because if you went up and you went in and got involved in a multiplayer game, you may find yourself gaming and wanting to game and get distracted from working. So I would say there's a place for games, maybe leave that at home, and there's a place for entertainment. I would say try to keep a focused perspective, a focused mindset, and if you can do that with games, great. But I found that with most, you know, that would take you away from concentrating on the task at hand. we do have to multitask, but thankfully we have automations like some software like an installer here to do a lot of the monotonous tasks for us. So when we run these automations in these programs, let's give them time to work, and let's go do what they're giving us, and that is more time to focus on other things. So that's just my feedback there on waiting on these installers. Normally during these times I take to teach about what's happening, but you also want to consider how you manage your time in this industry. So you can see it grabbing all the dependencies for Visual Studio Code, and it's installing the packages related to Python that we chose when I checked that Python development add-on or extension. It's almost complete. Once it's complete, we will go back over here to MySQL installer, and when we open the MySQL installer, we're going to go and see if those checkboxes will get filled in. Like here, the checkbox is filled in, but I'm not going to click next yet because this is still installing. So I want to make sure that the system is completely, Visual Studio being the system, is fully installed before I proceed with starting the installation of this main MySQL installer. And before we get MySQL on this system for good, we want to make sure those dependencies have finished installing in the locations they need to be in. So we can see that now we have all these checked, but again, try not to proceed with an install until it's completely finished, especially when it's a dependency. So Visual Studio is our dependency, and MySQL is requiring it in its list of applications that it uses. Alright, so it's finishing up this install. We're hanging right there on 99%. I have a bit of an impatientness about me. I'm spoiled by the speed of some of the things we have here in IT. Solid state drives, lots of RAM. It feels like everything should just happen as soon as you want it to. And we're getting there. But, patience is a virtue. So it looks like we're done. We don't have to launch Visual Studio Code. It's going to launch itself. I'm not going to sign in. Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code is a Microsoft product that they have open sourced the development of and are continuing to improve upon. I really do like it. You always want to launch your programs too. They will, if they don't launch themselves, just to make sure they did install properly. So looks like that's fine. That's just logging in. We'll be okay. Let's next through. Execute. It's going to look for some dependencies here. The one that we do need, I want to make sure that we have, is the MySQL for Visual Studio, which errored out. So we need to get that extension. So what are we going to do? How about we Google it? So MySQL for Visual Studio, and look, it'll finish it for us. Google's my favorite automation. Here we go. All right, let's go ahead and download that and install it. This is a lightweight program, so it should finish relatively quickly. Alright, and we're finished. Let's go ahead and click through now. So that was pulled in, so we'll just keep going. Go next. These are networking settings, which is essentially allowing this database server or this database install to be accessible over a network. So if we could open this up to the internet or allow our IP address, and we could have our development system on a separate system other than this server, which would be a best practice. But for starting out and just learning databases and database administration, you can have your development environment on your hosting server, which is what we're doing here. This will be easier up front, but as you advance in your skills, just understand it is a best practice to distribute that workload. So I'm going to hit next. I'm going to leave the default setting, create a strong password or passphrase. I would recommend, if it's something that, if you don't have a password manager like KeePassXE or 1Password that can generate huge passwords for you and remember them, then I would create a lengthy password that you can remember. Something that's a passphrase, something that you could associate with a memory. I know you will see some recommend not using a password that you can remember easily. I would say if you don't have a password manager, then you should create a password that you can remember, but just make sure it's got a mixture of alphanumeric characters in it. So if you say, ball could be 8 at 11 exclamation mark. And I know that's not enough characters. I would recommend at least 13, 8 maybe, but you really want to look at this as if you got to remember this password and you don't have a password manager, then you should use a passphrase. That would make it more secure. So ultimately, we're moving to a passwordless world, and you can look that up in a separate video and online. But for this, go ahead and create your password, something you can remember so you can connect back to it, because this is our practice development environment. So go ahead and hit next. We're going to leave this here. It is going to start a Windows service, which is how Windows will start MySQL every time the system starts up. With a server, typically you don't want to shut down your server all the time. If you're in a school environment, maybe you'll shut off your server because you want to save credits and you don't want all your AWS credits to run out. So that I would recommend shutting this down as a student, but as an IT professional in a business environment, you would leave this running. Uptime is everything. So next, we're going to execute this. And this is what I love about software, and software like this. It's open. It's talking about, it's not hiding anything about what it's doing. It's showing us what it's doing every step of the way here in Windows. It's writing the file, updating the firewall, and it needs to update the firewall so that connections can come through to this system, at least the firewall on the operating system itself. So let's finish, go next, and then finish. So we are done. What happens next? We need to use MySQL Workbench, which is our graphical interface to MySQL and really the start of the developing of databases. So I'm going to go ahead and search for MySQL Workbench. See if it is going to pop up here for us. I believe I saw it in the list of applications, but if not, we can always go download it. Here we go. Download now. Let's go to downloads. Skip this. You do not have to create an account. You can just say no thanks. Go back here. I should have grabbed this right here. Sorry. So you're going to go back and you're going to get the actual Workbench installer. We already got the MySQL installer, which is why the application should have actually been installed, but for some reason it didn't. This is why you always test and check. Here we go. Alright, so Workbench is getting installed, and you'll notice that it will pop up as soon as the install is done, and we'll be able to interact with our MySQL server. So I'm going to finish that. And here we go. So here's MySQL Workbench. This is what you're going to be accessing to start to develop your databases and create your very first database. What you'll notice is a successful thing here is that our MySQL connections list isn't telling us that we don't have MySQL installed. So if you had MySQL Workbench installed but not MySQL, or you had an issue with MySQL starting up, it would give you an error message here that says it did not detect the presence of a MySQL install. So we are successful in our install of MySQL. This is where we're going to go ahead and type in our password that we created for root. We're going to log in, and here we are. We could start the development of our database. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video has helped you. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out via email, Discord, or any other means.